Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And today we are undertaking a bit of an institutional autopsy. We're looking at the invisible architectures that govern modern life. And I really don't use that word govern lightly here.
It sounds a bit ominous, honestly, when you put it that way. I mean, when you say architecture, I assume we aren't talking about, brutalist concrete buildings or highway overpasses.
No, although the metaphor actually holds up pretty well. We are talking about the operating system used by corporations, governments, and massive agencies to manage human populations. Specifically, we're talking about the systems of probabilistic modeling and statistical risk management.
Okay. Probabilistic modeling is usually where my eyes start to glaze over just a little bit. So what are we actually talking about here? Is this just the algorithm that decides what ad I see on my phone?
It's much deeper than that. We are getting into the central tension between individual experience, how you and I actually live our daily lives, which is messy and highly specific and statistical aggregation, which is how we are managed by the powers that be.
So it's basically the conflict between me, the human, and me, the data point.
Exactly right. And to really map this out, we are digging into a fascinating set of case studies from the book Numbers Rule Your World by Kaiser Fung. But I want to be really clear right off the bat, this is not a book review.
Right. We aren't here to critique the pros or talk about data literacy broadly. We're here to steal the core insights for this deep dive.
We're using Fung's work as a lens to dissect how decision-making happens at the highest institutional levels. We want to understand why systems often feel so incredibly broken to you as an individual, even when, and this is the controversial part, they are working exactly as designed.
That's a bold claim because, when I'm stuck in traffic or I'm fighting on the phone with an insurance company, it definitely feels like the system is completely broken. But you're saying it's actually working.
I'm saying it is optimizing for something you aren't seeing. And that disconnect, that friction, is the crisis in perception we're talking about today.
Wait, I am listening. So where do we start?
We have to start with a ghost story, actually. We have to start with the invention of the average man.
The invention. You say that like he's a machine or a gadget.
Historically, he is a construct. We really have to go back to the 19th century to a Belgian astronomer named Adolphe Quetelet. Now, Quetelet was completely obsessed with finding order in chaos.
Okay.
He looked at human populations, which, as we know, are chaotic, diverse, totally unpredictable, and he wanted to find the fundamental rules that govern them, just like the laws of physics govern the stars in astronomy.
So he basically applied astronomy math to regular people.
Precisely. He began measuring absolutely everything: height, chest size, weight, crime rates, suicide rates, and he averaged them all out. He created this composite character, l'homme moyen, the average man.
Okay, but that's just basic statistics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we use averages all the time. The average height of an American male is, what, 5'9"? Why is measuring that a problem?
Because Quetelet didn't just see the average as a raw number. He saw it as an ideal. He genuinely believed that the average man represented nature's true perfection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in his view, the average was the truth. And anyone who deviated from that average, too tall, too short, too heavy, too thin, was essentially a biological error.
So if I'm, say, 6'2", I'm not just tall, I'm literally a mistake in his eyes.
In Quetelet's philosophical framework, yes. But the real danger arises when you stop viewing this as just quirky 19th century philosophy and start using it as a blueprint for institutional engineering. Which brings us to the U.S. Air Force in the late 1940s and early 50s.
Okay, the dawn of the jet age.
Right. And the Air Force had a massive life or death problem on their hands. They had the best technology in the world. Jet engines were getting incredibly fast, but their pilots couldn't control the planes. They were crashing constantly.
Yeah.
Runway accidents, mid-air collisions, just totally inexplicable errors.
Was it a training issue? Or maybe the planes were just too new?
That is exactly what they thought at first. Or maybe a mechanical flaw. But the planes functioned fine mechanically. Finally, they hired a researcher to look closely at the cockpit design itself, because up until then, the entire cockpit was engineered specifically for the average pilot.
Which honestly makes sense on paper. You measure all your pilots, you find the average arm length, the average leg length, torso height, and you build the seat to perfectly fit that exact guy.
It makes perfect logical sense. So they decided to actually test this assumption. They took 4,000 pilots and measured them on 10 distinct physical dimensions.
Right, height, chest, reach, that sort of thing.
Exactly, 10 dimensions. And they asked a very simple question. Out of these 4,000 pilots, how many fit into the average range for all 10 dimensions?
I'm guessing not all of them, but maybe, I don't know, maybe half. If it's literally the average.
0.
Wait, literally 0 out of 4,000 people.
Not a single pilot out of 4,000 was average in all 10 dimensions. You might have a guy with average height, sure, but he has unusually long arms, or average arms, but a super long torso.
Right.
By designing for the average, the Air Force had engineered a cockpit that fit literally no one.
That's actually kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. The average man just doesn't exist.
He is a mathematical phantom, and this is the core hook for our entire deep dive today. If the average is an invention, then the systems built to serve the average are inherently designed to fail the individual in specific, completely predictable ways.
So if the institution can't design for every unique snowflake, it just simplifies. It treats all of us like the average.
Correct. This is the architecture of simplification. You cannot manage a population of 330 million individuals if you have to customize the entire experience for every single person. The sheer complexity would paralyze the system instantly.
So institutions manage chaos by simplifying reality into measurable variables.
Yes, and the absolute biggest variable they try to control, the thing they hate the most, is variability itself.
Variability is the enemy.
It really is. And the best place to see this institutional war on variability is on the highway. So let's shift to our first major example and talk about the Minnesota highway experiment.
Oh, I actually know this one.
Yeah.
This is about those ramp meters, right? The little stoplights right at the end of the highway on-ramp.
Exactly. Now, I want you and everyone listening to put yourself right in the driver's seat. You're trying to merge onto the highway. You are late for work. You see the highway right there and the traffic is moving nicely. But you are stopped at a red light on the ramp.
I viscerally hate it. It feels like I'm being punished for no reason. I'm just sitting there wasting gas, gripping the steering wheel, while people on the highway are zooming past me. It feels incredibly unfair.
That exact feeling is what Kaiser Fung calls the slip and skip perception. You feel like you are being skipped over while people on the highway are slipping past you. It registers in your primate brain as a social injustice. You are being forced to sacrifice your time so some total stranger can drive fast.
Well, am I wrong? Because that is exactly what's actually happening in reality.
You aren't wrong about the sacrifice, but you are entirely wrong about the why. The traffic engineers aren't solving for your personal happiness or fairness. They are solving for aggregate flow.
But how does stopping me help the flow? I mean, if I just merged right in, I'd be gone. I wouldn't be causing a problem.
Think about a slinky. You know how if you hold a slinky on a table and you just tap one end, that compression wave travels all the way down the coils?
Yeah.
Traffic works the exact same way. It is a fluid dynamic. When a car merges onto a highway aggressively, the car behind it instinctively taps its brakes just a little bit to maintain a safe distance.
Right.
Then the car behind that one taps its brakes just a little bit harder because of reaction time.
And then the car behind that one basically slams on the brakes.
Exactly. That is a shockwave. It ripples backward through the traffic stream. One bad merge, one sudden fluctuation can cause a phantom traffic jam 2 miles back. So the ramp meter isn't there to stop you specifically, to space out the drops. It breaks up the platoon of cars so they enter the stream at a steady rhythm that the highway can naturally absorb without triggering that shockwave.
So it's essentially preventing a heart attack in the main artery.
That's a perfect way to put it. The goal of the system isn't necessarily higher speed for any one car. The goal is higher throughput for the whole system. They want to fit the maximum number of cars past a certain point per hour. And the only way to do that is to eliminate the turbulence caused by unregulated merging.
So scientifically speaking, the ramp meters work.
In terms of physics, absolutely. They work brilliantly. But remember, we are talking about a crisis of perception. The drivers in Minnesota didn't care about the physics of throughput. They cared about the fact that they were waiting at a stupid red light when literally no cross-traffic was coming.
Yeah, the optics are terrible.
The public hatred actually got so intense that the state legislature had to intervene.
Oh, politicians getting involved in complex traffic engineering. That always ends really well.
Right. They mandated a holiday. They passed a law to turn off all the ramp meters across the system for 8 weeks to study what would happen. They essentially told the public, fine, you want freedom. Here is the absolute freedom to drive.
I kind of love that. We are liberating you from the tyranny of the red light. So what actually happened? Did it turn into a commuter utopia?
It turned into absolute chaos. Unmitigated disaster. Without the meters regulating the intake, those shock waves returned with a massive vengeance. Travel reliability completely plummeted.
Let's define reliability here.
Yeah.
Because that's different from just speed.
That's the key metric for these systems. It's not just how long does it take, it's can I predict how long it will take. With the meters turned on, your commute might be 20 minutes on the highway, plus a frustrating 5-minute wait at the ramp.
But it's 25 minutes every single day.
Exactly. It is a highly predictable 25 minutes. Without the meters, it might be 15 minutes on a Tuesday and 45 minutes on a Wednesday.
So the drivers finally got exactly what they demanded. No waiting at the ramp at all. But the actual outcome was worse for literally everyone on the road.
The individual outcome felt better in the short term. I'm moving, I'm totally free. But the aggregate outcome was a total system failure. The system mathematically requires individual sacrifice waiting at the light for the aggregate efficiency of the flow.
It creates this wild paradox where the thing that feels the absolute most inefficient to me personally sitting at a red light on an empty ramp is actually the exact thing saving the macro system from total collapse.
And that profound disconnect is where the crisis in perception begins to take root. We judge the system entirely by our immediate lived experience, but the system is designed to manage the invisible flow of thousands.
Which brings us perfectly to the absolute masters of flow management, which is Disney. I mean, you literally cannot talk about crowd control or queues without talking about the Disney theme parks.
Disney is a really interesting counterpoint to the highway model. On the highway, the ultimate goal is throughput and speed. In a theme park, the goal is psychological experience management.
Right. And I was really surprised to learn that Disney doesn't actually design their parks for the busiest day of the year. You'd logically think they would build the park to handle Christmas Day crowds, like maximum theoretical capacity, but they don't do that at all.
No, because that would be totally economically unviable. Think about the massive capital cost. If you built enough roller coasters, restaurants, pathways, and bathrooms to handle the Christmas Day crush comfortably with no lines, the park would sit half empty and idle for the other 364 days.
That's just a massive waste of resources, extreme inefficiency.
Right. So instead, the engineers designed for what they call the design day, which is typically around the 90th percentile of peak demand.
Meaning they just mathematically accept that 10% of the time the system will be totally overwhelmed.
They consciously accept that the system will be strained on those peak days. They make a highly calculated structural decision that on those days, people will just have to wait. But here is the statistical reality that most guests don't grasp. Queues aren't just caused by a lack of capacity. They are caused, once again, by variability in arrival.
Explain that a bit more, because if I'm standing in a 2-hour line, I just assume, well, there are too many people here and not enough ride vehicles.
Imagine a ride that can perfectly handle 1,000 people an hour. If exactly 1,000 people show up, spaced perfectly, say, one person every 3.6 seconds, there is absolutely no line. You just walk right on the ride.
Okay, in a perfect robot world, sure.
But humans don't arrive like clockwork. A massive tour bus drops off 50 people all at once. Then nobody shows up for 2 minutes. Then a chaotic family of 10 wanders in. That variability, those random spikes in arrival, creates a localized backlog. And once a line forms, it is mathematically very hard to dissolve it unless the ride's capacity exceeds the demand by a massive margin.
So variability is the true enemy of efficiency here too, just like the highway. And this is exactly where the FastPass comes in. Although I always just assumed FastPass was a tool about getting me on the ride faster.
That is the brilliant perception Disney created. But statistically speaking, the FastPass system does not reduce the average wait time for the system as a whole.
Wait, it doesn't?
Think about the physics of it. The ride has a fixed mechanical capacity. It can only move a very specific number of bodies per hour. Handing someone a paper FastPass ticket doesn't make the roller coaster drive any faster. It doesn't magically add extra seats to the train.
So what is it actually doing if it's not speeding up the ride?
It is redistributing the uncertainty. It creates a virtual queue. Instead of standing in a hot, physical line packed with people, you are technically waiting while you go buy a churro or sit on a nice bench in the shade. It manages the psychological perception of time.
Wow.
It takes the variability out of the physical space, the line, and puts it into a hidden algorithmic reservation system.
So it smooths out the arrival spikes behind the scenes.
Exactly. The system is designed to manage your mind just as much as your physical body. Disney engineers, the Imagineers, realized through tons of data that people hate uncertain waits far more than they hate long waits.
That is so true.
If I tell you the wait is exactly 45 minutes, you can mentally handle it, you budget for it. But if the line stops moving for 5 minutes inexplicably, you start to panic. You feel that exact same injustice as the highway ramp meter.
You feel like something is broken, like someone else is skipping the line ahead of you.
Yes. So, looking at the Minnesota Highway and Disney together, the big lesson on institutional design seems to be this. Institutions design systems to smooth out variability because variability absolutely destroys efficiency.
Right. And to achieve that efficiency, they often have to restrict your individual choice or completely manipulate your perception of what's happening. The predictable average man is just vastly easier to manage than the chaotic, unpredictable individual.
Okay, so that's the base architecture of the system. Now let's talk about the fuel. What actually drives these systems to make choices? This moves us into the architecture of decision-making, looking specifically at incentives.
This is where we have to look at why organizations aggressively move away from human judgment and toward algorithmic automation. Because it's rarely just because, math is cool. It's because the institutional incentives demand scale.
Exactly. And the most ubiquitous example of this in our lives is the credit score, the FICO score. This is a number we all completely obsess over, but we very rarely think about where it actually came from.
This is a mathematical revolution that completely changed the entire American economy, right? But to understand why FICO took over, we kind of have to look at the old way of doing things. Like, before the 1960s and 70s, if you wanted a loan to buy a house, you physically went to a bank officer.
You walked into a grand building, you sat down across a heavy mahogany desk, you wore your best tie, you looked the man in the eye.
Right. And that loan officer basically judged you using the old 3 C's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Character, capacity, and collateral. It was completely handcrafted personal judgment. Does this guy look trustworthy? Does he have a steady job in town? Is he a responsible painter or a reckless plumber?
It sounds really nice and deeply personal, kind of like a scene from It's a Wonderful Life. But the reality is, I imagine it was also incredibly systematically biased.
Oh, it is wildly biased. It was highly subjective, incredibly slow, and very expensive for the bank. If the human loan officer didn't like your face or your race or your gender or your last name, you simply didn't get the money. End of story. And because that specific loan officer was personally judged and compensated on whether his specific loans got paid back, he was structurally incentivized to be ultra-conservative. He only bet on absolute sure things.
So the flow of credit was incredibly tight. If you were an outsider in any way, you were completely out of luck. Very tight. Enter the algorithm, Bill Fair and Earl Isaac come along and basically say, we can replace all this messy, subjective human judgment with a standardized score based purely on data.
And this is the massive shift from handcrafted rules to algorithmic scoring.
Yes, and the core incentive here for the banks was scale. With automated algorithmic underwriting, you didn't need a highly paid human to sit and stare at every single application for an hour. You could process thousands of applications in milliseconds.
Which directly led to a 1,200% explosion in consumer credit. It literally built the modern consumer debt economy as we know it today.
But there is a massive catch to this scale, and this is the black box reality of the system. The algorithm, despite having all your data, doesn't actually know you.
It doesn't know you at all, and it frankly doesn't care about your personal story or your character. This is a really critical distinction in statistical modeling we need to highlight. The credit score relies entirely on correlation, not causation.
Break that down a bit for the listener. What is the functional difference there?
Okay, causation is answering the question, why did this happen? Correlation is answering what tends to happen together. The credit algorithm just finds mathematical patterns. It might find out that people who rent their home and have 3 credit inquiries in the last month are statistically 20% more likely to default on a loan.
But does it actually know why I have 3 inquiries? Like maybe I'm just aggressively shopping around for the very best mortgage rate. Maybe that actually makes me more responsible.
It doesn't care.
Yeah.
It simply puts you in a bucket with everyone else who happens to have those exact traits. The system creates a correlation bucket. And if the historical data says that bucket is risky, you, the individual, are treated as risky. The key insight to remember is this. The system does not care why you pay your bills. It only cares that you pay them.
It feels incredibly dehumanizing. I mean, it reduces my entire complex life history to a 3-digit number.
It is deeply impersonal by definition.
Yeah.
But it is also highly, highly efficient. It completely removes the overt human bias of the racist loan officer, but it replaces it with the cold statistical bias of the group aggregate.
However, this blind reliance on correlation has major limits. And to see those limits clearly, we have to look at a field where correlation simply isn't good enough, where you actually need causation. And that field is epidemiology.
Right, the disease detectives.
Yeah.
Because in public health, you really can't just play the statistical odds.
No, you can't. Let's look at a major case study. The 2006 E. coli spinach outbreak. This was a massive, terrifying crisis. People were getting violently sick, their kidneys were failing, and it was spread across 26 different states.
Now, in the credit world, if a bank sees a negative correlation, they just instantly cut the credit line. Simple, it's cheap. If people in a certain zip code stop paying, you just stop lending to that zip code.
Exactly, but in public health, the stakes and the costs are entirely different. You cannot recall an entire nation's food supply based on a statistical hunch.
Right.
Because if you issue a massive recall on all bagged spinach and it turns out the actual culprit was romaine lettuce, you have completely destroyed the spinach industry, cost billions of dollars for nothing, and people are still dying from eating the lettuce.
So you desperately need causation. You need the absolute smoking gun.
You need to be as sure as humanly possible. But here's the structural tension. You never, ever have 100% perfect data in real time. You are always working in the fog of war. So the incentive structure for these statistical modelers relies heavily on what Fung calls the virtue of being wrong.
The virtue of being wrong. That sounds incredibly counterintuitive for a rigorous scientist.
It actually comes from a very famous quote by the brilliant statistician George Box. He said, "All models are wrong, but some are useful."
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning a statistical model is never, ever a perfect one-to-one replica of reality. It's always a simplification. The goal of the institution isn't divine perfection. The goal is to be measurably better than random chance, or better than the current status quo.
So in the middle of this terrifying spinach outbreak, how do they apply that?
They use something called a case control study.
How exactly does that work in the field?
First, they meticulously find the cases. Those are the people who are actually sick in the hospital. They interview them exhaustively. What did you eat last week? Where did you shop? What restaurants did you visit?
Gathering variables.
Yes. Then, and this is the absolutely crucial genius part, they find controls.
And who are the controls in this scenario?
Healthy people who live in the exact same geographic area, have the same rough age, the same demographic profile, and the epidemiologists call them up and ask them the exact same exhaustive list of questions.
Ah, okay, so they are actively looking for the delta, the difference.
Right. Because think about it, if 80% of the sick people ate bagged spinach, that sounds incredibly suspicious at first glance.
Very suspicious.
But if 80% of the healthy control group also ate bagged spinach that week, then spinach probably isn't the culprit. It just means spinach is a really popular food in that town.
I see. You essentially have to mathematically prove that the sick people did something very specific that the healthy people didn't do.
Exactly. And in the specific 2006 case, the difference they found was incredibly stark. The sick people had eaten a very specific brand of bagged spinach at a rate that was statistically impossible to just be a random coincidence. The probability of that difference happening by pure chance was essentially zero.
So that gave the government the mathematical confidence to act.
It did. It allowed them to trace the physical supply chain all the way back to a specific lot code P227A and eventually to a specific shift at one specific processing plant.
Wow. So the fundamental incentive in epidemiology is to build a causal chain strong enough to withstand the massive economic cost of a recall. Whereas in the credit market, the incentive is just to process as many loans as humanly possible with a highly predictable aggregate default rate.
Precisely. They are very different systems with very different structural incentives, but they both fundamentally rely on simplifying the messy individual into a manageable data point.
Which logically leads us to the inevitable failures of these systems. Because if you are constantly simplifying reality, you are absolutely going to make mistakes.
And not just random, oops, I dropped the ball mistakes. We are talking about deeply structural, mathematically guaranteed mistakes. This brings us into outcomes, and specifically to what's known as the iron law of testing.
The iron law of testing. That honestly sounds like a brutal decree from Game of Thrones.
It's almost as unforgiving, really. The iron law states that in any probabilistic testing system, you absolutely cannot minimize both types of errors simultaneously without some massive technological breakthrough. You always, always have to trade one error for the other.
We probably need to get a little technical for a second here to explain this. Type 1 and Type 2 errors. I know people always mix these up, including me. Can we get explained like I'm 5 on this concept?
The absolute easiest way to conceptualize it is a standard fire alarm in a bidding. A false positive, which is a type 1 error, is when the alarm starts blaring, but there's actually no fire at all. It's just a false alarm.
Right. Which is super annoying. You have to walk down the stairs, stand in the cold, but ultimately nothing burned down.
Exactly. Now, a false negative, a type 2 error, is when there is a raging fire in the kitchen, but the alarm completely fails to go off. It stays completely silent.
Okay, that is a vastly scarier error. The building literally burns down while everyone is asleep inside.
In the context of a fire, yes. The false negative is a catastrophic outcome. So knowing this, engineers purposefully tune fire alarms to be incredibly trigger-happy. They would much rather deal with 10 annoying false alarms than miss one single actual fire.
That makes perfect sense. Better safe than sorry is the governing rule there.
But what happens when the false alarm is the thing that destroys someone's life or career? Let's take that same logic and look at steroid testing in professional sports.
Okay, so the stated goal of the testing agency here is to catch cheaters.
Theoretically, yes. But you have to look closely at the incentives of the institution actually running the test. If they get a false positive, meaning their test accuses a totally innocent star athlete of doping, what actually happens to the agency?
Well, it's a massive nightmare for them. The athlete forcefully denies it. They hire aggressive lawyers. They go on national television crying. They sue the testing agency for millions in defamation. The agency ends up looking totally incompetent.
Exactly. The institutional cost of a false positive is unbelievably high. It's expensive, it's humiliating, it ruins their credibility. Now, what is the cost to the agency of a false negative? Meaning, they test a guy who is juicing, but the test erroneously comes back clean.
Well, nobody knows. The cheater just keeps playing. The fans are super happy because their hero is hitting home runs. The sponsors are thrilled.
Precisely. The cost of that error is completely invisible to the public. In fact, for the sports league itself, a false negative is actually highly preferable to a massive public scandal.
Wow.
So, because the institutional cost of a false positive is so catastrophically high, they subtly rig the math of the system. We call them the timid testers.
Meaning they deliberately tune the alarm so it basically only goes off if the building is practically an inferno.
Yes. They set the chemical threshold for banning someone so incredibly high that they are absolutely certain. Structurally, they would much rather let 10 actual cheaters go totally free, those are the false negatives, than falsely accuse one single innocent person.
So when we watch a sport where literally nobody is getting caught for years, it doesn't necessarily mean nobody is actually cheating.
It very likely means the test system is mathematically optimizing to avoid lawsuits, not to catch every cheater.
That is fascinating. But now I want to completely flip the script. Let's look at a system where the institutional incentives are exactly reversed. Terror screening.
Okay, the stakes are obviously vastly different here. We're talking about agencies like the TSA.
What is the cost of a false negative in this environment? A false negative means an actual terrorist successfully passes through the screening checkpoint.
Right. A bomb goes off, planes crash, hundreds of people die. The cost of that error is functionally infinite.
And the cost of a false positive, meaning an innocent everyday traveler gets flagged by the system.
They get pulled into a windowless secondary screening room. Maybe they miss their connecting flight. Maybe they are intensely interrogated for a few hours.
Which, for me, the individual sitting in that room is a terrible, violating experience. But for the massive agency running the system,
it is entirely acceptable collateral damage. The better safe than sorry logic applies here, just exactly like the fire alarm. So the system is structurally rigged to be paranoid. They tune the sensitivity of the algorithms way, way up. The agency would gladly harass 1,000 completely innocent people if it means they don't miss one single bad guy.
But this hypersensitivity creates a massive mathematical problem, doesn't it? The base rate problem.
This is a really critical statistical insight. Actual terrorists are incredibly statistically rare. Let's say, hypothetically, you invent a magical screening test that is 99% accurate. That sounds amazing, right?
Sounds perfect. 99% is an A+ in any school.
But if you are deploying that test to look for, say, 10 actual terrorists hiding in a traveling population of 100 million people, that tiny 1% error rate is going to completely bury you.
Because 1% of 100 million is a huge number.
It's going to generate 1 million false positives. You are desperately looking for a needle in a massive haystack, but your fancy needle detector actually thinks 1% of the hay is also needles.
So you end up generating a pile of false needles that is vastly bigger than the actual haystack itself.
And the human analysts drown in the noise. The end result isn't actually robust safety. its security theater, and the slow erosion of individual civil liberties. In security systems, the rights of the individual, specifically the right not to be falsely accused and detained, are routinely sacrificed for the perceived safety of the aggregate.
It's essentially the Minnesota highway experiment all over again, but this time with handcuffs and interrogation rooms instead of just ramp meters.
That is a very chilling but mathematically accurate summary of how the architecture works.
So we have these vast systems governing us. They're structurally biased, they generate inevitable mathematical errors, they treat our complex lives as mere averages. Why on earth do we keep them? Why do these probabilistic systems persist?
That brings us to our next core concept, persistence and the logic of aggregation.
Let's talk about insurance risk pools here, because this is where the cold logic of grouping really directly hits your bank account.
Insurance is a fascinating industry because it's based entirely on two massive opposing forces, pooling and splitting.
Okay, pooling is pretty simple, right? It's lumping a bunch of people together to spread the risk out. If 1,000 of us each put a little bit of money in a big pot, and one guy's house tragically burns down, the pot can pay to rebuild it easily.
Right, that's the solidarity part of the insurance model. We are all ostensibly in this together, sharing the burden.
But then there's the other force, splitting.
Splitting happens when the statistical data clearly shows that one specific group inside the pool is consistently costing the pool too much money. Take hurricane insurance in Florida as a perfect example.
Right.
Historically, basically everyone in the state was lumped into one big statewide risk pool. But over time, the data got much better. The meteorological models got more precise, and the actuaries realized that homes built right on the coast were statistically distinct, vastly more risky than homes built 50 miles inland.
So the risk simply wasn't being shared equally anymore. The coastal mansions were constantly draining the communal pot.
Exactly. If the insurance company stubbornly keeps everyone in the exact same pool, the safe inland people are effectively subsidizing the risky coastal people.
Which feels incredibly unfair to the inland people paying high premiums.
So the actuaries split the pool, they aggressively jack up the rates for the coastal group, or they simply drop their coverage entirely.
But the second they do that, the coastal people immediately scream, "Hey, this is discrimination. You're targeting us."
And this right here is the fundamental institutional tension. When exactly does mathematically rational segmentation become socially unacceptable discrimination?
The math doesn't care about feelings.
No, and the system persists because it literally must segment to remain financially solvent. If one noble insurance company decides to ignore the data and altruistically charge everyone the exact same flat rate, a ruthless competitor will instantly swoop in.
And that competitor will just cherry-pick all the safe inland customers by offering them slightly lower rates.
Exactly. Leaving the first noble company with nothing but a pool full of risky coastal homes waiting for a hurricane. It's a phenomenon called adverse selection. The raw math of the market forces the segregation, whether we like it or not.
Let's move to another incredibly controversial sorting mechanism that relies heavily on aggregation. Standardized testing, specifically things like the SATs.
This area is an absolute minefield of statistical misperception, and we really have to talk about Simpson's paradox to understand it.
I absolutely love Simpson's paradox because it completely breaks your brain the first time you hear it.
It really does. It's a statistical phenomenon where aggregating data actually hides the underlying truth. The classic textbook example of this is the UC Berkeley admissions case from several decades ago.
Right.
Berkeley published their aggregate university-wide admissions data, and looking at the top-line numbers, it looked incredibly damning. It looked like men were being admitted at a vastly higher rate than women across the board. It looked like clear institutional gender bias.
So the big aggregate number screamed bias.
Yes. But then statisticians started drilling down into the data. They looked at the admissions rates for the individual specific departments, the engineering department, the English department, the law school, and so on.
And what did they find in the weeds?
They found something completely shocking to the public. In almost every single individual department, women were actually being admitted at a higher rate than the men.
Wait, I have to stop you there. How is it mathematically possible for women to be winning in almost every individual department, but simultaneously losing in the grand total? That genuinely doesn't make intuitive sense.
It's because of the denominator.
Right.
It's about where they were applying. Women were overwhelmingly applying to the absolute hardest departments to get into, programs like English or psychology departments that had hundreds of highly qualified applicants fighting for just a handful of open spots.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Men were overwhelmingly applying to departments like engineering and math, which, at that specific time, had far more open spots and vastly fewer total applicants. The aggregate average was being massively skewed by the individual choices of where to apply.
So the aggregate lie completely hid the granular truth.
Exactly. And this kind of statistical illusion happens in standardized testing all the time. The people who make these tests struggle constantly with something called differential item functioning, or DIF.
What does that mean in practice?
They actively try to ensure that a math question about, say, a cricket match doesn't artificially favor British students over American students simply because of cultural context. They have to constantly try to strip the cultural bias out of the raw math.
But if these aggregate tests are so incredibly flawed and prone to illusions like Simpson's paradox, why do universities and institutions keep using them?
Because despite all the known glaring flaws of aggregation, the alternative, which is purely subjective, handcrafted individual assessment of millions of students, is viewed by the system as vastly less efficient and far more prone to the kind of overt human bias we saw with the old loan officers. The testing system persists purely because it scales. It is widely viewed by institutions as the least worst option available.
We've talked deeply about how these systems are designed, their incentives, and their trade-offs. But what actually happens when our human intuition tries to fight the system? This brings us to the interconnection and feedback loops.
This is what I call the crisis of intuition. Our human brains are incredibly powerful pattern-matching machines. Evolution designed us to see patterns everywhere. The rustle in the grass means a tiger.
Right.
But in a massive mathematically random world, our intuition constantly betrays us. We enthusiastically see patterns that simply aren't there, and we completely miss the massive structural patterns that actually are.
The lottery example from Fung's book is absolutely perfect for illustrating this, the Ontario lottery scandal.
This is a phenomenal statistical detective story. Up in Ontario, Canada, regular people started noticing a really strange trend. The retailers, the guys actually standing behind the counter selling the lottery tickets, seemed to be winning major jackpot prizes at an alarming rate.
Like, suspiciously a lot.
Yeah.
Way more than you'd expect.
Now, human intuition looks at that and says two things. Either, wow, these guys are just incredibly lucky, or maybe they just buy a massive ton of tickets because they work there.
Which sounds totally plausible.
But a statistician named Jeffrey Rosenthal looked at the situation, and he didn't look at the winners. He looked at the background data. He looked at the denominator.
The total universe of all lottery tickets sold in the province.
Exactly. He meticulously calculated the exact mathematical probability of that specific group of retailers winning that many major jackpots purely by a random chance.
And what were the odds?
The odds were 1 in a quintillion.
A quintillion. I don't even know how many zeros that is.
It is a 1 followed by 48 zeros.
Wow.
And this brings up a core statistical maxim. Rare is impossible.
Meaning?
To a trained statistician, if something has a 1 in a quintillion chance of naturally happening and it actually happens, it simply didn't happen by chance. It's a systemic fraud.
The game was rigged.
It was massively rigged. The retailers were stealing winning tickets from clueless customers. But the general public completely failed to see the systemic fraud because they fundamentally didn't understand the denominator. They just saw a pattern of lucky winners on the news. The statistician, looking at the aggregate data, saw the impossible mathematical anomaly.
Now let's flip that exact intuition failure. Let's look at air safety and what's known as the cluster illusion.
This is the exact opposite problem. Think about how the news cycle works. A tragic plane crash happens. It's everywhere on the news. Then, randomly, 2 weeks later, another entirely unrelated plane crashes. Then maybe another one a month later.
Our intuition absolutely screams flying is no longer safe. The entire aviation system is fundamentally broken. There's a deadly pattern here.
I remember this vividly with the Egypt Air and Alaska Airlines crashes years ago. The public was absolutely terrified to fly.
But Arnold Barnett, an MIT statistician, looked at the actual macro data, and he applied that same maxim. Rare is impossible, but in a different way.
How so? He argued that if the aviation system is fundamentally safe, which the long-term data overwhelmingly proves it is, commercial flying is incredibly safe, then a small, tragic cluster of crashes in a short time frame is just random statistical variance.
It's like flipping a totally normal quarter and getting heads 3 times in a row. It feels weird, but it absolutely doesn't mean the coin itself is broken.
Exactly. But the flying public doesn't buy that mathematical logic. Their intuition demands a causal narrative.
They demand action. They demand safety.
And so the government politicians inevitably react. They implement sweeping new rules, massive security theater at the airports, sweeping policy changes, and this creates a massive feedback loop.
Public fear, which is based on faulty intuition, forces structural policy changes in the system.
Yes, and those changes generate entirely new data, which is then fed back into the institutional risk models, often making the entire system vastly more cumbersome and annoying without actually making it measurably safer.
We constantly demand absolute certainty from a fundamentally probabilistic world.
We do. And that profound friction brings us right to the ultimate conclusion of our institutional autopsy.
We've arrived at the core thesis. So I have to ask you the question explicitly. What is the crisis in perception here?
The fundamental crisis is that we are living in a vastly complex, inherently probabilistic world, but we are instinctively reacting to it with rigid, deterministic intuition.
Unpack that tension for us.
We constantly mistake statistical averages for personal guarantees. When the weatherman goes on TV and says there's a 60% chance of rain, and we go out and it rains, we think he was right. If it doesn't rain, we think he was an idiot and he was wrong.
But he wasn't right or wrong in a deterministic sense.
Hello. The probability itself was the reality. There was a 60% chance. Both outcomes were always possible. When an algorithm gives you a credit score of 700, you internalize that and think, I am a good, reliable person. But the banking system doesn't see a good person. It just sees a historically verified 70% chance of repayment.
And when the personal outcome deviates from our expectation, when we get soaked in the rain without an umbrella, or when we get brutally denied that mortgage loan, we feel deeply personally betrayed. We feel the entire system is corrupt or broken.
But the hard truth is, the system isn't designed for us as individuals.
Not at all.
No. The system is engineered to manage massive populations. You, as a specific, living, breathing individual, can absolutely be a false positive. You can be the tragic anomaly that gets detained at the airport or denied the life-saving surgery. To you, that experience is an absolute tragedy. It is your whole life.
But to the system?
To the system, your tragedy is just a calculated cost of doing business. You are a statistical rounding error in the pursuit of aggregate efficiency.
It really highlights the gap between systemic rationality and individual fairness.
Exactly. A system can be perfectly structurally rational, like those ramp meters ruthlessly optimizing highway flow, but still feel viscerally, deeply unjust to the single person sitting at the red light watching empty pavement.
We spend all our time focusing on the average. The average return on our investment portfolio, the average wait time at Disney. But it's actually the variance, the sudden market crash, the unexpected 2-hour delay that destroys our wealth and causes all of our daily anxiety.
The ultimate crisis in perception is that the massive invisible architecture of modern life, the credit algorithms, the insurance risk pools, the standardized tests, the security screenings, is specifically designed to manage uncertainty by aggregating us into nameless buckets. But we don't live in buckets. We experience life entirely as unique individuals.
And until we truly understand how these statistical systems think, until we finally learn to see Quetelet's average man as a complete mathematical fiction and accept that variance is the true reality of nature, we will always feel like we are at war with the very world we built.
We relentlessly demand certainty from systems that were specifically designed only to manage uncertainty.
So that is the crisis.
It is.
A crisis in perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis in perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.